Bien, bonsoir. Et donc, bienvenue à cette dernière session.
Good evening and welcome to our last session, a round table in French. So first of all, I'd like to say that Madame Royale, who's our Minister of Ecology, was not able to be present, so she has had to apologize. She was supposed to be introducing our session, but she was unfortunately unable to come in. So she has, of course, as you know, an extremely demanding schedule, and thus she was not able to come in and join us, which is a pity for her. But we are, as you can see around this table, there are 6 of us, and I will basically be opening the debate by indicating various questions that I have and would like to see my neighbors address. So I'm going to be giving each of them 5 minutes to answer the questions. And then after that, we will have a more general conversation. So the question I'd like to ask to all those here all around our table is as follows. We have just spent 2 days together listening to a number of presentations. And I believe that the general opinion is that the density and quality of the information that was provided during these 2 days was at an excellent level. I'm sure you would agree. And so thus, what is this going to change, on the other hand, in terms of your feeling? And I am addressing my neighbors, but of course, you too can also think about that as well. What is your feeling about the 3 major types of questions? First of all, what is going to be happening during the COP21 in Paris? So, Carlo talked about the half full, half empty glass. And we had a number of pessimistic points of view yesterday. And so this morning we had Carlo, who had a far more optimistic point of view. And I'd like us all basically to talk about these different perspectives. And our second series of problems, which was also sort of a thread throughout a number of presentations. What can we ultimately do in terms of world governance on a global level? And especially if we want to stabilize the climate after 2030, should we have, for example, a single price for carbon? And Mr. Weissman said that we should perhaps negotiate this. But I have certainly learned a great deal myself, and now I know exactly what I should do if I were the benevolent dictator of humanity. I'd say we should, of course, set up a market system, cap and trade on a world level, give quotas to the various countries. And then I was thinking that, okay, I'd base these quotas on various allocations according to identical heads. And I received a lot of threats from a number of secret services. And so I had to renounce this solution, this ambition. I realized there's no way I could actually implement this kind of thing. So thanks to Martin Weissman, I learned that what I needed to do was that if I were president of the World Republic and all the states were my citizens, at that point I would have a majority vote. And then the results would tell me that I could find here an agreement on the carbon tax, a price. And so I made some progress there. I'm still not sure what I should do if I were in our current situation. Of course, here I am not a world dictator, nor am I a president of the Republic of Nations. But let's say that I could be, say, president of the Republic of France, for example. I still don't know what I would do, but in any case, the third question, or group of questions here, and that's where I will cease joking here. The third question is also an essential one. The question is, given what's going to be happening at COP21, as one could predict, and keeping in mind that it is, of course, insufficient in terms of what we need to do for the climate, what would be the paths or trajectories that we should explore where we might have some chance of making progress, some kind of world governance, a satisfactory world governance instruments? For example, given today's constraints and the ideals of the future, we have, of course, these little streams moving into this great future river. Is there some of these little streams which might improve things in the future? So these are the questions that I would be interested in having you react to. The first who will be speaking is Thomas, who is going to try to give his own vision, his own summary of our 2 days. Thomas, the floor is yours. So the idea here is that every one of you takes about 5 minutes to speak. So Thomas, you get 6 minutes, okay? Well, thank you so much. It's not easy to summarize this entire discussion. It was certainly extremely rich. And of course, the problems are also extremely vast. However, we did have some bad news. Last week, there was in Nature, this magazine Nature, we at Birkensank were showing us that the damage from climate change is probably going to be a lot more severe than what we were actually thinking. We're going to lose a lot of economic growth, and inequality are going to increase. So that means that the people in poor countries are going to lose even more. And we know that the negotiations currently happening in Paris is a kind of global theater, which, as Scott Barrett was saying, or showed, since '88, we had all sorts of meetings and discussions, and it's almost sort of like, well, the themes vary a bit, but we've returned now to the same point where we were 5 years ago. And I do not want to be pessimistic, because, of course, this problem is far too important. But nevertheless, it would be too optimistic to hope that we might be able to really find a solution in Paris this year. So the INDC, that is to say the contribution of every country that they determine on their own, are going to be voluntary. These are going to be contributions, but there's almost no national codes here and very little control mechanisms, of course. And having said this, I think that it is perhaps a necessary step forward, but we are far from really dealing with the idea of constraints. Now, Martin Weissman was talking about, in a convincing way, about the structure of the negotiations and how we may not be talking about the right mechanism. So instead of negotiating on quantities, we should be negotiating on a minimum price. There's a lot of economists who would agree with this, in fact. Now, we could add to all these problems that there are a lot of problems of inequality in the world, and lobbies, and political economy, various aspects that make the problem even more complex. And I was in the GIEC, and I presided over the instruments section. And there are those who want to see the more positive side of things and will say, okay, more countries who adopt instruments to manage the climate via taxes or other kinds of negotiable systems. But often this is at such a low level, the price is so low that, in fact, it doesn't have much of an effect. So again, this is, of course, a beginning, but this risk, these various political processes, adapting instruments, all this has the risk of going far too slowly, in my opinion, given that the damage are perhaps more serious than we thought. Thus, it's indispensable, as Stéphane showed us, we must seek to totally decarbonize our economies. And this implies, perhaps, other strategies as opposed to this 20-30% reduction. It seems that there are a lot of people who believe that the world emissions are increasing, and perhaps someday, if China in 2030 is it's going to change. Everybody thinks, okay, there's going to be some magic that it's going to happen here, and everything's going to go down to zero just by magic. But no, this is not going to happen every year. In fact, it will probably continue to increase. So thus, we need, in fact, a more and more stringent policy every year. Now, we have plenty of difficulties. And we also have some other points which, of course, give reason for hope. Among them, we have technical progress in general, and this will give us more efficiency, but also in the field of renewable energy, especially solar energy, perhaps. There are apparently a field or technological area where we've been seeing progress. Every time we reduce the scale of the object, the production scale becomes greater, costs decrease, and so this would seem to me to indicate that we have some hope, and thus we were able to show that there was a possibility in terms of solving problems. But this does not mean we still have to put a price on carbon. Otherwise, humanity is perfectly capable of expending a great deal of renewable energy, but also a great deal of fossil fuels. So I'm not saying here that we don't know. We have to continue to make an effort, of course. And, of course, this will always be necessary and always difficult, but perhaps a little bit less difficult. In other words, the velocity of technical progress in the renewable energy area gives us certain possibilities in terms of weakening the fossil fuel lobbies, reinforcing renewable lobbies, and perhaps also being able to create instruments, rules, treaties, which are far more stringent during the future years. We need to go quickly over the next few years. So I think that this is basically what we need to do in Paris. We need to start this process. Thank you, Thomas. Let me pass the mic to Carraro from the University of Venice. The floor is yours. Thank you, Roger. So you're the one with the optimistic point of view. Exactly. So because in any case, it's an important result compared to the past. And we've had an increase in emissions over the last 10 years, which we've never seen before. That's extraordinary. 10 years negotiating, discussing, doing certain things, which we have been able to observe some reductions, but at the same time, our emissions are increasing. So Paris will at least have as some major result the fact of stabilizing the situation. So they may not be able to reduce the emissions. I mean, they might be reduced in terms of business as usual, but in absolute terms, it is not going to reduce emissions. We will be again seeing perhaps a stabilization, and we need to see what this all means. The UNFCCC has recently published, not long ago, an assessment, and it shows that in terms of absolute emissions, we might go up by 10% by 2030. So it's almost stable, shall we say, if one compares this to the fact that we had a rate of 2.3% increase over the last years. So stabilizing by 2030 is a good result. But in any case, we have here our half-full glass. And so we need to look at that as well. On the other hand, we also know this is not sufficient. The real objective of the Conference of Paris is not the reduction of these emissions, but rather, for the UNIDC, we need to have some true objectives, which is to set up these control mechanisms and various, of course, sanctions, penalties for countries which do not respect their commitments, and also we have to make sure that various countries are going to reduce their emissions. So that's about a third of the total. These support measures, and financial, of course, as well, need to be all implemented. But the real problem in Paris, or what's at stake, is the governance, the mechanism in order to verify, control, apply, implement, and also financing. So here too, we are at a very interesting point, because during the conference we heard that there are about 80 of the $100 million necessary that were perhaps, well, in any case, the countries agreed to contribute to that sum. We're up to 80, so we need to get up to 100. And at Paris, we hope to manage that. But in any case, these have to be properly spent. We need to find the right mechanisms and a model of governance to use them in the developing countries. Now, the conference, we're expecting a lot from it. The last session on finance I thought was extremely useful as well, and especially Patrick Bolton, because he was showing us that there is another player here which is going to get involved and who is going to help us out, because when we have the International Monetary Fund, which will be using the risk of climate change as a criteria of evaluation, or actually the stock market itself, because when we build these indices which consider the climate change risk and mitigation policies, that is to say the possibility that certain reserves of fossil fuels may not be used, in which case the value of those companies will be decreased. But when we do this, we can still see in the field some major players who can change the balance of power and who can perhaps upset things such that the result will be in favor of those who are currently attempting to fight against climate change. So in terms of negotiations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there's yet another aspect. May I keep going? I just have one more little thing, 1 minute. So there are 2 days we haven't talked about yet. It was not the purpose, of course, but what about adaptation to climate change? And in Paris, we'll be talking about this, and this is a good idea. As you were saying this morning, the concentrations are 400 parts per million, and the 2 degrees of temperature increase will be difficult to avoid. And Thomas is reminding us that the consequences are going to be more serious than what we thought, and also happening much faster. So it's looking at what has happened, for example, in the Arctic. We were completely mistaken. We had basically forecasted that the ice melting, how do you say that in French? Ice melting was going to be much slower, but in fact it's going incredibly fast. And in 10 years, in September, there was not going to be a single bit of ice in the Arctic. So clearly it will reform during the winter, but this is an extraordinary change, which we simply had not predicted. So it's happening a lot faster and in a much more serious way. So we need to prepare for this. And it could also, of course, be an opportunity for investment development. But again, we have to do this. And we need also to give it a direction. We need to create a certain convergence in terms of investments in the right direction. For this, we need to ensure that all these different actions have value in reducing emissions and controlling the impacts of climate change. And a price, a value, reasoning and thinking after Paris on a carbon price. All this is very important. Thank you, Roger. It certainly was a great conference, and I think there are 3 main questions here that have arisen. First of all, is the COP21 going to accelerate this international carbon price approach? We have a very broad agreement among economists in terms of the direction we need to go in, but we've seen yesterday that the way to get there is going to be a tough road. And I think what's also important here is we've heard there's idea of this club. Now, we may not go directly towards a global system of tarification or pricing, but via these clubs, that could be possible. Secondly, is this carbon pricing something that can reinforce the INDCs? And I think there's some other questions that underlie this one, which is that it could help us improve cost efficiency and increase our ambitions, and this pricing could also perhaps help us build a system of reporting, verification, and measurement, which is extremely important. It is truly at the heart of our negotiations, and I don't think we're going to succeed if there's not some kind of a financial incentive for the countries. Thirdly, is this carbon pricing going to contribute to this transfer of 100 million per year? And I'm not totally as optimistic as Carlo. I don't think these $100 million are already present. Sorry, 100 billion, yes, 100 billion. So we agree, 100 billion. Okay, so now what would be the ways forward for accelerating things, and what kind of work will we have to do after COP21? That's important too. So I see a few ways forward here, and upon which we can base our work. So it should be perhaps judicious to think about a triggering system which would work on the basis of a system we might call what we call in English carbon pricing rebate. And therefore, we could start a sort of average benchmark, which would be the benchmark for emissions per person. Donc, it's a question on price again. I heard what Martine was saying. You have to really go straight to the price, I think, and thus we need to think about a system where we have a sort of world benchmark in terms of emissions per inhabitant, and thus countries where we have emissions that are above this will have a debt vis-a-vis the collective, and so each country that is under this reference would have a credit, which could be calculated, by the gap with regard to the average multiplied by the number of people. So would this be automatically covered? No. We need, in order to be able to get this credit, you need to get into the system. And here we have what you might say a very powerful instrument as an incentive for low-emission countries who are not in the system. And, of course, you need to find the way to convince these debtor countries to pay their debt. And from that point of view, I think that even if one can trust finance, how can I put this, to find some leverage and financing, I think that we probably won't be seeing any ambitious agreements ultimately in terms of reducing the GDCs if there's not some simple principle regarding the fact that these big emitters need to pay. So what system can we set up? Well, if we refer to the social value of carbon, we're never going to set that up. We need to move onto this broad platform of the low price. A low price, like $1 for a ton of CO2. And then you can transfer $14 billion given the emission rates in 2012, 2013, can't remember. $7 on the other hand, you could end up with $100 billion per year. So if you're in cruising speed, then you have another interesting function here, which is each country that would have the incentive to reduce its levels faster than the world average. And thus you could increase your bonus or reduce your debt if you have a problem there. So we need to think about this kind of situation, a question of a kind of a priming process or seed money, which would let us sort of change this average reference or benchmark and then move more to a future system where we would have a carbon tax and similar to Martin's approach. Now, what about the club concept? I am totally struck by the fact that today, if we aggregate the various European emissions, with the IUTSs, and then you have Chinese plants where the 7 points emission trading are going to change into a huge system in China if you add Korea. And also the various governments in North America, where we have the carbon market, we already are seeing a critical mass. So what's incredible here is that these markets are developing with totally non-coordinated ways with systems that don't communicate. The extreme example being in the United States between, say, 2 states, the maximum price of one is under the minimum price of the other. So I think that one of the major advances that could result from the Paris conference would be that there is some kind of total change in the way we manage these markets in a sort of disorganized way, such that they can all converge in 2015, the date when we will sign this agreement, and move towards a more unified system for the carbon market, which would be transcontinental. But there is a risk. The risk being that if we are to do some linking, as we see recommended a great deal with existing markets, we'll be seeing a balance that will be towards where you have the carbon market, which is managed in a non-coordinated way. Then you have fear. You're afraid the price will go up too much and something will go down. So this would imply some kind of strong political will and governance that has absolutely no comparison with the very low level of governance we have currently in the world today in terms of carbon market. It's really practically does not exist, especially for European quotas of CO2. So I'm not totally in agreement with Carlo's optimism, but how can I put this? I am, of course, support his commitment, and I believe that the outcome of our Paris conference should give us some new ways to progress towards this carbon pricing at the levels I've discussed. Thank you.
Merci, Christian.
Thank you, Christian. I'll give the floor to your neighbor, the one on your left, who's going to answer your questions with his personal viewpoint, which is more finance-oriented. At least I will be expressing the viewpoint of the French authorities. And my statement will be much shorter than the previous ones. We can't hear me? He's not speaking close enough to the microphone. So as I said, I will be limiting my statement to global governance. And it seems to me that the COP21 could be innovative to that regard. And it is certainly a promising conference, because the finance sector is now involved in our fight against climate change. Thanks to the involvement of the Financial Stability Council that has been invited at the COP21 negotiating table, with 2 objectives in mind. That is a better factoring in of the climate-related risks by the financial sector. So there is, first of all, the risk in terms of damages, meaning that insurances will have to cover the cost of damages to infrastructures. And in addition to that, there is the risk on assets due to the change in public policies. For instance, the value of assets will be pretty much dependent on the future carbon pricing, if any. And this is what there is the tragedy of horizons, as it was described by the governor of the Bank of England. Now, the horizon of the damages due to climate change is maybe far, while the horizon of the financial related aspect is much in a shorter term. Now we're hoping to impulse future work during the conference and after the conference, so that the financial sector will consider and factoring the public policy changes in their governance and in the way they manage all these funds. Now, the magnitude of these changes can be considerable. I remember some statements and presentations showing that if we were to consume the fuel so as to meet the 2 degrees target, only of a low stock would be burned, and it has already been considered in by the oil companies. The third aspect, which is also very important, which is related to the awareness under Pillar 3, and this is what the bank authorities are supervising, that is the greater sensitivity to climate-related risks, which may lead to important perception changes, and that will also have an impact on the value of these institutions. So that's, I think, an innovative feature of the future COP21 conference, and we're hoping that we're going to put on the agenda of the International Stability Council this aspect. First of all, by defining an international reporting framework on climate-related risk for the financial sector. And the second aspect would be to streamline what we've already started to do in France, that is stress tests for financial operators. That is a harmonized framework to assess potential risks that they're exposed to, so as to see how resilient the banking sector here is to these risks. And there's finally a third thing that I wanted to mention, which is the definition of an institutional framework to encourage investing in energy transition. This has already been around for some time, but we would like to further this instrument, because we've all understood that if we want to raise important amounts of money to support energy transition projects, we need carbon pricing that will be more significant than the current price of carbon. And there's also a need for an official framework with some predictability that would be an incentive for the financial sector to invest and to expect some returns from these investments. So these are innovative aspects. Of course, there will not be the focus of the COP21 negotiations, but we're hoping to put them on the international agenda, and we're hoping that the International Stability Council will focus on that too.
Benoît Leguet.
Merci, Roger.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you for having invited me to take part in this final panel discussion. I'd like to briefly introduce my organization, which is Not Why Not. I am the director, I4C, Institute of Climate Economics. It is a think tank fostered by the French Development Agency and by CDC, that is Caisse des dépôts et consignations. We were called in the past CDC Climat Recherche. We're still working on the same topics with the support of AFD, which is the French Development Aid Agency. No. I'd like to fill in the gaps of the previous sessions. I will remember what Christian Gollier said yesterday, who said policymakers don't even know Economics 101. But And many economists don't know international climate negotiation 101. Policymakers also have to deal with externalities such as, am I going to be reelected or not? And climate change is not their only concern, quite naturally. So it's very useful to shed light as scholars and researchers. And I would agree with Stefan when he said, let's wonder also about the feasibility of what we're putting forward. And there was a fascinating debate on the pricing of carbon. As far as I know, nothing is going to happen as far as carbon pricing at the COP21. It won't be in the remit of the negotiating bodies. At least it's on the agenda of negotiators. Maybe something will happen after the conference, but not during the COP21. So I've wondered about this carbon pricing issue, and I've followed the line of Stéphane Algat. You need 3 bullet points. First of all, is it good or wrong, right or wrong to have a carbon pricing? Some have said yes, it's right because it's an externality, while Stéphane said, well, we should have differentiated prices of carbon, implying that there are some consideration as to the structure of the sectors and the cost-benefit for a country to set a price on carbon. So it might not be the right answer to the problem of climate change. Is it an externality? Do we need to save the planet? Or is it something related to the co-benefits from emission reductions? So is there a benefit in putting in place such a carbon pricing? So there are 2 different things. Second question, is it useful to have a carbon pricing? I am a technician of carbon pricing, and there are 40 explicit different carbon pricing through quotas or taxes ranging from 3 to 100 euros a ton of CO2. Some developed countries have covered this. Some developing countries have projects in the pipelines, and there are different schemes to price carbon. And Christian Perthuis has also recalled that the third step would be the generalization of a carbon pricing in China. They currently have 7 pilots, and they will have a generalized overall price for the whole country. Now, is it useful to have a single price of carbon worldwide? Well, you shouldn't put the cart before the horses. Not all the prices are the same. Should we complain about it or let the flower bloom, as Stéphane Algat has said, and then try to put things together? I would be in favor of the second approach. Let us not discourage those who've gone for it. There is a higher likelihood of having a price of carbon in the countries when we tell them do whatever you want rather than imposing them such a price. Then is it feasible or is it achievable in the current setting around COP21? I would say it's very difficult. I've understood Martin Weitzman, who said it's easier to negotiate a price rather than 125 quotas. Of course, but today nobody is negotiating 125 quotas. We're in the pledge and review process. It's no longer a top-down type of approach. So even the fact that we are negotiating, the idea of negotiating 195 quotas has been abandoned. So maybe the best would be not to negotiate any price. That would be the simplest way. In a pledge and review process, this is what is done. Countries are coming up with their INDCs, and then the question arising from that is what will be the outcome. But before trying to answer this question, the carbon pricing issue has raised many questions in my mind. That is, what would be the method to recommend it? I've understood voting, but if we were to be an advisor to a given country, what method would be suggested? Isn't there a risk if we try to have a single price of carbon that it would be the least bidder that would be the winners? The simplest way would be to go for the lowest price. And maybe there are examples that I could give. Third issue is how do you control, how do you monitor, how do you supervise the price of carbon? Is there any oversight considered in this process, in this project? Then, when it comes to INDCs, I agree with Carlo And Roger's questions, is it a half full or a half empty bottle? Regardless of anything, the important thing is to have the bottle, I would say. We should rely on the existing institutions and bodies. There is little time ahead of us, and the existing bodies have some problems, but they're not that bad at what they're doing. On the state side, there is the Framework Convention, and we're not very far. I haven't gone through all your assumptions, but we're not far from a cost-efficient trajectory. So it's an interesting conclusion that you have drawn. Besides that, it's not only the Framework Convention of the United Nations on climate changes, but there are also other international bodies that could be involved. And there is also the monitoring, reporting, and verification. We have to make sure that things have actually been implemented, and this should be verified. I don't believe in international penalties. I would say difficult for an international body to constrain to have a binding agreements on states. But in institutions, you do not only have states, at least for the first day and a half. We've worked a lot on what states and governments could do. In the second half of today, we've considered what could be the role of the finance sector, and the finance sector can indeed play an important role. Patrick Bolton has talked about institutions and what individual institutions could do to manage the risk, the carbon risk. But then this leads to two questions, because then it's the individual role of institutions that is considered. Well, what will public financial institutions do? Coming from a think tank that is financed by the CDC, this is a concern to me, and I wonder what influence this is going to have on the private sector. And then what about the systemic risk? We've talked about the Bank of England. Financial operators are here to manage their risk and not the overall global risks. And recently, climate has been factored in as a systemic risk. You've talked about the Financial Stability Council. I will also remember two things beyond this Financial Stability Council. In May 2015, CDC has organized with EIB, we've organized a Climate Finance Day, an event to attract not people who are interested in climate, but people who are interested in finance. We have had 1,200 attendants. A year ago, we would have organized it with 100 attendees, and 2 years ago, we would have had only 20 attendees. No, the number of investors, banking institutions, bankers who at first sight are not interested in climate change came and rallied us because they've realized that there is a risk management issue. Now, in the Bretton Woods annual meetings of Lima this year, on the same picture, you could see the Bank of England, the Central Bank, People's Bank of China, and the Bank of Bangladesh. A developing country, an emergent country, a developed country, the three of them gathered around the same table to talk about climate-related issues. And that is really new. This is a great change for the future. Now, this is my answer to your question, what is it that we can do? And my answer would be we can certainly be ambitious with the help of the finance sector. Maybe we should make sure that climate is integrated in all financial decisions of our governing and ruling bodies. Thank you.
Un certain nombre de points d'accord et un certain nombre de points de désaccord.
I'm sure there are points of agreement and disagreements. There are two comments I'd like to make on the role of finance and financial institutions. They're just responding in a very rational way. Corporations and financial institutions are exposed to risk, and they want to have a climate policy that is well and robust. So the feasibility of the climate policy and the legitimacy of this climate policy should be reinforced, and the financial sector will follow suit Now, Carlo has shown this morning a diagram where there were the INDCs of the country, the possible costs of those groups of countries who had submitted their INDCs. Now, with a bit of additional assumptions, we could have calculated a global carbon price and an allocation of burden and a sharing of burden that would have been based on more equality throughout the world. A single price is not necessarily something I agree with. I will not necessarily rely on Carlo's diagnosis for that, but if you have two countries with different carbon prices, but that have set their own rules, it will be in their interest to work together because it will be a win for both countries with lower costs. It doesn't mean that it is easy by the same token. Of course, in order to have a global cap and trade and quotas, this is a solution that is not within reach, unless we believe Carlo, up to a certain point. But having a single price of carbon is a recurring issue because when you don't have a single price, you can try and put the system closer so that it will cost less to everyone. So that was my first comment. I also wanted to comment on the standpoint of governance and what can be done after Kyoto. A new idea has emerged, and I've believed in it right from the beginning, which is that in order to improve global governance, if you put environment and trade together, the convention or the agreement should have as a scope environment and trade. Because as Martin said, if you cover too many topics, it becomes impossible. If you were to focus only on two topics, it would be easier to have an agreement that can be enforced. So trade and environmental issues should be linked in a single agreement. And Nordhaus' suggestions, which was to have climate clubs and levy import taxes to protect some countries, is a penalty. I would never have dared doing that, because I think I would have been criticized as a French person of being too protectionist. But it's paving a way further, going in the right direction. If we want the world to go better, I think that trade and environmental issues should be tied up in the same agreement. I've been a bit long, but now I give the floor to those who wish and talk about prices, for instance. In my view, I think that for the sake of the climate, we should have at least the highest carbon price. These prices do not need to be equal from one country to the next, but just as many countries and sectors and industries should pay a high price for carbon. Now, whether it should be a single price to everyone, of course, that's a possible source of savings, but some are against this idea, and that would be very difficult to implement. Christian. I'd like to say two things. When you talk about cap and trade, Roger, we should, I think, make the difference between the Kyoto cap and trade system, which applied to states, and today we're all aware that it's far too difficult to implement. They will never be implemented because for a very simple reason, which is that when a state is non-compliant, the state starts to negotiate and then leaves the agreement or the protocol. While if you have a cap and trade applied on corporations, this is what Carlos said this morning. You should have been with us. When you put a cap and trade scheme and impose it on companies, when a company is non-compliant, then it will try its best endeavor to be compliant. And one way of trying to conclude on the debate that you have is that our baseline should be what countries have already done or what countries are doing today. When they price carbon, they have domestic carbon trade schemes. But each country, because of the lack of coordination between those countries, are not very stringent with their carbon trade, because before introducing the system, they're afraid that the prices might go too high, and 4 years down the road, they manage surpluses of quotas, of emission quotas. So an important stream of action would be to coordinate the carbon trade, the domestic carbon trades that have been enforced, and such coordination would mean that if it is stringent coordination and if there is an ambition for that, those countries will converge towards a price which would be much higher than the one you have when there is no coordination between the respective carbon trade schemes. Therefore, the idea of these clubs of countries where in their economic area there would be a price on carbon by tying up or linking up all these carbon trade schemes. There is one thing I'd like to add, because we've also talked about technological innovation yesterday and today, and we've heard that important changes are on the way, particularly in the renewables. Such changes are going to make investments in solar and wind power systems with higher returns. So much so that renewables are today competing with other sources of energy. The difference is not high enough yet. Maybe my presentation was a bit too optimistic because there are concealed costs such as the intermittence of power generation because of the lack of a storage system with batteries, etc. But what is really missing, and which will have to be adopted, not in Paris because it's too late, but in a future conference of the parties, would be an international framework for research on climate technology. We've done that for space. We didn't see any usefulness in investing so much money to launch satellites or to send out a rocket to the moon, but now we realized how useful it has been. In the case of climate, we'll know much better the positive impact of such investment plans. And the public effort to invest in climate-related technologies is something achievable and which is certainly affordable compared to other major investments that have been made in the past in other research programs. And they would help us to find technological solutions to solve problems for the future, not for the past, because for the past, today we're living with the emissions from the past. Here, there are also technological solutions to try and remove some carbon, but not enough effort has been made. It's a bit the short-sightedness of finance that is involved here. Oil companies have been, short-sighted, and they were not ready to prepare the ground for the time when climate policies were to be invested by government, so much so that oil companies or fossil fuel companies see that their assets value is going down. So maybe they're going to take the necessary steps now. So there is a need for a global effort on climate-related research. It's a very good idea indeed. There is an international effort on the third generation of nuclear power, so why not have one on climate or green technologies for solar power, etc.?